The New Orleans Saints have the best odds to win the NFC South this year, but what's the case for and against them living up to those expectations? Locked On Saints host Ross Jackson joins me on today's Locked On Falcons to discuss that subject.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host, the most humble host that has ever existed of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen. Of course, shout out to the everydayers who subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever they listen to podcasts. And guys, today's and tomorrow's episode will be joined by our fellow NFC South co-hosts, Ross Jackson and James Yarko, to talk about the teams that they cover on a daily basis. You heard earlier this week, Ross and James share their thoughts on the Falcons, but let's get some insight into the teams that they cover each and every day. Of course, you're not going to hear about the Panthers because Locked On Panthers host Julian Council is a coward and had scheduling conflicts or something that prevented him from being on the show this week. But, you also heard earlier this summer my thoughts on each of these teams' fatal flaws. So we'll get into those with both James and Ross. But today we'll kick things off talking with Ross as he tries to convince, as you can probably guess, I remain unconvinced, convince the world that the Saints are actually the favorite to win the NFC South. So let's get into that conversation with Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints right now. All right, everyone, we are back with another illustrious guest. He is none other than Ross Jackson, the host of the hated Locked On Saints podcast. And he is here with us to talk about the New Orleans Saints. Yes, we are getting a quote-unquote enemy perspective on our NFC South rivals, and we'll be talking all about, the good and the bad headed into this 2023 season for the New Orleans Saints. But Ross, my friend, welcome back to Locked On Falcons.
Thanks, buddy. Glad to be here with you. Always excited to be able to chop it up with you.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in and talk about how the NFC South is wide open, right? It's pretty much anybody's division, but the odds seem to favor the New Orleans Saints. They are the favorites when we go to our favorite sports book at FanDuel. Plus 135 as of this recording to win the NFC South. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious from your perspective, Ross, what is the reasons why, sports books like FanDuel and others are so high on the Saints team to win the South? What is the case for the Saints taking control of this division this year?
Yeah, I'll say that even with those sports books kind of favoring the Saints in that they have the best odds, the thing that I would mention is that if I remember correctly, the entire division's in plus odds. So it's a very cautious optimism around the New Orleans Saints in the way that Vegas looks at them. But I think probably the reason why it all comes down to the quarterback position. Desmond Ritter's young. Bryce Young has never taken a snap as an NFL player over with the Carolina Panthers. And who knows whatever's going on with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, whether they have Baker Mayfield or Kyle Trask, they look like they're playing for Drake May or Caleb Williams for the next year. So I think that's a part of the reason why sportsbooks look at the New Orleans Saints and say, okay, there's a name at quarterback that we're comfortable with and that we're familiar with and all these other things. And so we're going to give them the best odds. I really think it simply just comes down to having that veteran quarterback that's got 9 years of experience.
So when we look at this Saints team, is it as simple as, hey, they upgraded quarterback with Derek Carr, they getting Michael Thomas back, this team is going to be better than what they were a year ago?
No, and that's the tricky part because there's the pitfalls that arise in all this too. But if we're sticking to the positives around where New Orleans is, I do think that getting Michael Thomas back is something that gives you another layer of cautious optimism because who knows how many games he's going to play. He's played 10 games in the last 3 years. Can you get 10 games out of him in 2023? We'll have to wait to see. He's squatting 450 pounds. He's posting his workouts on Instagram. He's doing all the things that make you feel like, okay, he should be good to start the season, but how long can he last throughout the season becomes the thing. And look, he's got a motivating factor to make it as far as he can into the season as possible because it's an incentive heavy deal based upon his availability, based upon team success, and based upon his own production as well. So he's got the motivation to be out there and get it all done. But really, I think that the reason why people are a little high on the New Orleans Saints relative to the other teams in the division, because they don't tend to be high on them nationally or across the entire NFL, it's just really about the NFC South, is simply because like this is a team that has put together a very good defense that for the most part is still intact. The defensive line underwent a huge kind of change, as you well know, as several of them fled to the Atlanta Falcons to join good buddy Ryan Nielsen, which was a fantastic hire by the Falcons, by the way. But, you know, they have a lot of continuity in terms of their defensive leaders over on that side of the ball. They have a lot of continuity in terms of the talent over on the offensive side. They add Jamal Williams, who was the rushing touchdowns leader just a year ago. They bring in Foster Moreau at tight end. They have two stellar second-year wide receivers in Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, who can make noise with or without Michael Thomas on the field. So I do think that there's a little bit of the optimism that comes at New Orleans based on the quarterback, but I think some of it is also the continuity of some of the veteran leaders, and then maybe some of the weapons that can be pretty exciting if utilized well, and of course, if everybody can stay healthy on this New Orleans Saints team.
Okay. Well, you made a somewhat compelling case. Obviously I'm a little harder to convince than most when it comes to positives about the New Orleans Saints. We'll
Fair.
see what the listeners have to think about it. But you made a somewhat compelling case for why the Saints should be favored in the NFC South. But let's talk a little bit further about maybe some of the pitfalls they may run into that may cause them to struggle to live up to, Las Vegas and FanDuel's expectations by taking care of this division. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons here with Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints. Guys, it's time to take your first swing betting on Major League Baseball at FanDuel, and you'll get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. If you bet $20, you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting on everything from the money line. You can use in parlays. You can use over unders. You can talk about, bet on who you think is going to hit that first home run. It's all on an app that's safe, secure, super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. Who can complain about that? So there's no better place, guys, to bet on Major League Baseball than at FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/locked-on, and you'll get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. So, of course, I'm here with Ross Jackson of the Locked On Saints podcast, and we just talked about the case for the Saints taking care of business and winning the NFC South. Now we're going to be flipping the script and talking about what could be some of the pitfalls that the Saints may run into this upcoming season. If we're, time traveling ahead to 6 months from now, and we're talking about why the Saints failed to live up to expectations by taking control of this division. Ross, in your eyes, what would be some of those things that may cause them to slip this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and I could probably have a longer list of things that concern me about the New Orleans Saints and things that make me fully confident in them. And some of that just comes with what have we seen on the field so far? Squat, right? We haven't seen this team actually on the field as it is. And so I think that that's the big thing that maybe you look at that could potentially undercut this team's potential. This team has a lot of potential. They have a weak a weak division. They have a weak schedule. All these other things can work in their favor, but can they put it all together on the field? And they had a lot of trouble doing that last year. They never established a true identity. They had a lot of injuries that impacted that. They had to change quarterbacks. They built this offense for Jameis Winston and then tried to make it work with Andy Dalton. That's just never going to work out. So there are a lot of things that are kind of out there and in the way for the New Orleans Saints going into 2023. But I do think that the biggest and most immediate concern is, can they put it together out on the field? Will all of these new pieces, the new quarterback, the new coaching staff, the new defensive line, the new weapons on the offensive side, can they all put it together with one offseason, or are there some growing pains there? And if there's growing pains early on in the season, that could cause the Saints a little bit of trouble because it stifles their momentum and ability to be able to pick things up as they go through. And then you have to ask the injury question. And that's the other big pitfall for them. The New Orleans Saints have been remarkably injured over the course of the past couple of years. And we know that injuries happen with every team across the NFL. It's not an excuse. It's the biggest equalizer in sports, but they've dealt with a historic number of injuries or illnesses and absences and all these other things over the course of the past 2 years in terms of number of starters that they've had to use, all these other things. They've had 5 different quarterbacks over the course of the past 2 seasons. So I think that like the next thing you have to look at is, can they stay healthy? And so if they struggle at the beginning of the season with chemistry, but then deal with a bunch of injuries that kind of derails the end of their season, where's their peak? And I think that that's the thing that becomes the biggest concern for this team, especially with so many backloaded divisional games this year. The Falcons week 12, as well as week 18. They've got the Carolina Panthers late. They've got the Bucks late. There's just a lot of those division games packed toward the end of the season. If this is a team that can't stay healthy, that back end of the schedule following their bye week could be detrimental to them, especially if they start off slow, as they're apt to do. I mean, we've seen it over and over again for the New Orleans Saints, starting off 1-2 or sometimes 0-3, and then building the charge later on. Building that charge later on is going to be really hard if they can't stay healthy.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, Derek Carr is probably the most proven quarterback in this NFC South division, which is, I think, as you said, a big reason why people have the Saints favored, just because all the other teams have major question marks at that position. But one of my major question marks for the New Orleans Saints, and I talked about this recently a couple of weeks ago on a podcast when I sort of broke down what I thought each team's, in the NFC South division's flaws were, is Pete Carmichael good? And that's the question that I have to ask you, Ross Jackson, that even if Derek Carr is the best quarterback in this division, does he have the type of play calling that is going to allow him to flourish in that way? And I'm just curious to pick your brain on that.
Yeah, I think that the play calling this year will be better for Derek Carr than it has been the past. I'll cautiously say the past 2 years. I don't know that play calling was really an issue back in 2021. And even still, that wasn't Pete Carmichael, right? That was still a Sean Payton. It's just that he had 4 different quarterbacks that he had to call plays for throughout that season. So looking back to last year, again, you built an offense for Jameis Winston that you had to try to run for Andy Dalton. You can't just recalibrate an offense going from a Corvette to a Honda Civic in, the matter of a week. That's going to take time. You need an offseason for that. And they didn't have an offseason between weeks 3 and 4, unfortunately. And so that became a big issue that kind of derailed what they were looking to do and how successful they wanted to be over on the offensive side. And I also think that the other piece of it too is that if you look back to Pete Carmichael, where he has been successful as a play caller, 2011, where he called the majority of that season because of the ACL injury that actually sent Sean Payton up to the booth. So he had Pete Carmichael call plays so he could be down on the field. That was the most yardage ever accrued by a single team, 7,474 that year. The next year, Sean Payton's suspension year, Pete Carmichael called the plays, and they were the one of the top 3 offenses in the NFL. The difference there, though, is that they had Drew Brees, who was a big part of that. So how much of that was Pete Carmichael's play calling versus how much of it was Drew Brees executing the offense well? And I think that's where maybe you get a step closer to Drew Brees with Derek Carr than you were with Jameis Winston, certainly than you were with Andy Dalton, certainly than you were with Ian Book and Trevor Siemian and all the other quarterbacks that have played for them in 2021 and 22. So I do think that it gets him a bit of a step closer to a comfortable offense to call. But Derek Carr is still not Drew Brees, and he's never going to try to be Drew Brees. He's never going to be Drew Brees. So how much of that gap can Pete Carmichael make up in 2023 is such a huge question mark that we have to see come together. But at least Derek Carr gives him something that's a little bit more comfortable in terms of his play calling style than the offense that he's architected and what the style of that offense can be.
Okay. Now, my last question is for the defensive side of the ball. As you mentioned, they lost a number of players on that defensive line, and I'm just curious, how good can the Saints defense be? Is it still going to be the unit that it has consistently been under Dennis Allen's leadership the last several years as a top 5, top 10 unit? Or is this a defense that might suffer some fall off this year?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of people that disagree with me on this point, but I think that this defense can still be very good as long as they maintain their efficiency and effectiveness against the pass. In today's NFL, the run game helps, but it doesn't put points on the board the way that the passing game does. We saw the New Orleans Saints last year, who were 2nd in the NFL against the pass, 24th in the NFL against the run, and they were still a top 10 defense, and they were still a top 10 scoring defense. And so what we've learned across the NFL is that, yes, the run game or being, weak against the run game does allow teams to be kind of two-dimensional. But if you can take the passing game away still, you can keep points off the board. This is a defense last year that allowed just 20 points or less over the course of the last 8 games of the season. The Saints haven't done that since the Dome Patrol was in town. And so I think that if you can maintain that level of acumen, that level of performance against the pass, but you don't move the needle much against the run on the defensive line, or you're a middle of the road defense on the defensive line, as long as you can still be a top 5, top 3 defense against the pass, you're going to put yourself in situations to win games. So I think that the defensive line migration, or rather exodus, that happened to them will have an impact, but I don't know if it's an impact that's going to cost them games, especially with the talent that they used, that they brought back in. Colin Saunders, who's a multiple-time Super Bowl champion with the Kansas City Chiefs, has still fresh legs, but is one of those guys that's a run stopper, but has really good footwork and can be disruptive in the middle of the defensive line. Nathan Shepard, one of the most athletic pass rushers on the interior in the league, top 10 last year in pass rush win rate, according to Pro Football Focus. And then they add in Brian Brees, who is an outstanding talent, but has to stay healthy. So I think that they're in a good place in terms of what they've done with the defensive line, although they might still struggle against the run. But as long as they're still strong against the pass, they should put themselves in position to win games.
Okay. Well, Ross has done his best to, sell you on the New Orleans Saints, or maybe you're still a little skeptical for some of the issues that he just raised. But Ross, I really appreciate you joining me on today's Locked On Falcons, talking about the New Orleans Saints. It hopefully will be a very long time before we have to utter, that team's name here on this illustrious podcast. But you are an illustrious guest, so I will give you the floor to plug, what you guys have going over on Locked On Saints all summer long.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think the most important thing for anybody listening to this is to make sure that you're still tuning in every single day to Locked On Falcons and Aaron Freeman, who does one of the best jobs on a single podcast here across the entire network, not just in the NFL. So let me give you your flowers first. If you're interested in what's going on with the New Orleans Saints, particularly heading into training camp, you can come over to Locked On Saints and listen in a little bit. I'm not sitting here trying to tout the New Orleans Saints as the best team in the NFL or anything like that. I'm looking at what are some of the position battles going into training camp that are going to impact this team. You're probably going to want to know who's lining up against guys like Drake London and Kyle Pitts and so on and so forth. The New Orleans Saints have a big time battle, both at linebacker as well as, particularly backup linebacker, but, second corner, all that stuff. So there's a lot of big stories around the New Orleans Saints in terms of how their roster is going to be constructed that impact the Atlanta Falcons. So come on over. You can check out all of that good work over at Locked On Saints every single Monday through Friday.
All right, guys, there's still more to come on today's Locked On Falcons. We'll be looking ahead to the 2024 NFL Draft, talking about how UCLA edge rusher Laiatu Latu might be the quote-unquote alpha that the Falcons are looking for at that position. We'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, guys, but before we get there, I do want to give another shout out to my everydayers that tune in each and every day. And for those of you that will be tuning in tomorrow, we'll be joined, of course, by James Yarko of Locked On Bucks, and we'll probably also talk a little bit more about another 2024 prospect on the offensive side of the ball, a pass catcher. We will probably not be talking about a wide receiver, though, so that may be a hint. But you heard me earlier this week in a mailbag. Someone asked me sort of what are the Falcons' potential top 2 needs going into next offseason, and I said wide receiver and edge rusher, right? And we're doing this now because this was around the time, around 4th of July last year, that we looked ahead to the 2023 draft because, I did not have that high of an opinion of the Falcons at that time, as you guys well know. And I was thinking, well, there's a silver lining to the Falcons being bad this year. They'll be able to land Will Anderson or Jalen Carter in next year's draft. That, of course, did not work out quite that way. But, I think it's worthwhile for us to do a similar exercise and at least, talk about some guys that I like, right? We'll see how I feel about these guys 6 months from now or 9 months from now. Obviously, my opinion on Will Anderson was not as high after the season as it was before the season. But we'll see how that goes. But you're probably not going to hear me talk too much about wide receivers because, Corey Davis exists and he's going to be a future Falcon in the next 2 months anyway. So why, focus on scouting wide receivers ahead of time. But I will be checking out some more edge rushers this summer. But one player that I did check out last year in the lead up at the end of last season and was kind of hoping he would come out last year so that the Falcons could nab him at the top of the draft, was Laiatu Latu, the UCLA edge rusher. He kind of first came on my radar because he was one of a handful of guys that was just as, if not more productive than Will Anderson last year, and dominant in several games. He dominated my beloved Pitt Panthers in their bowl game. He dominated USC. So if you watch that USC game to watch Caleb Williams or whatever, you'll see Laiatu Latu kicking butt, number 15 for UCLA. And why I like Latu is he kind of reminds me a lot of Jalen Phillips, right? Similar in that there are guys that rush with more of a plan than your typical college pass rusher that tends to rely solely off of physical ability, whether that's speed or power or whatever that is. And you guys may recall that I was higher on Jalen Phillips than a lot of other people, right? I think out of the last like 3 draft cycles, you could argue that Jalen Phillips is the best edge prospect, with the exception of maybe I think I had Aiden Hutchinson a little bit higher, but I would rate out Jalen Phillips as a better prospect than guys like Kayvon Thibodeau or Will Anderson that were much hyped. And I feel like Latu's in that sort of tier as well. And what's also notable with the comparisons to Jalen Phillips is they have similar backgrounds due to major medical issues that caused both of those guys to briefly retire from playing college football, right? Phillips initially went to UCLA, then retired due to a concussion, got a car accident, then wind up transferring to Miami, played really well there, and wound up being a mid-first round pick in the 2021 draft by the Dolphins, while Latu started out his career at UW, University of Washington, then retired due to a neck injury that he suffered, and then wound up transferring to UCLA, got cleared, and played last year. And it was very productive. Could throw some PFF stats at you, but all you need to know is basically his pass rush productivity, which is their per snap metric, and his win rates, basically blow the doors off of any of the first round edges that have been taken over the last, 3 or 4 years. And so most of the guys that hit his numbers in those levels tend to play at lower levels of competition. And the fact that Latu was able to do this at a Power 5 school is impressive. Now, granted, some of you, and I would generally agree with you, doing it in the Pac-12 is maybe not as impressive as doing it in the SEC or the ACC, but dominance at the end of the day still is dominance. And so, he is dominating guys that at least will have a chance of playing in the NFL, rather than guys that, very few of those guys will wind up in the NFL compared to the, group of 5 schools versus the Power 5 school. But, I'll be curious to see where he winds up going, right? Because I felt like Phillips was, despite being the super talented player, wound up being a mid-first round pick. I think he went like 18th overall, 16th overall, somewhere in the middle of the first round, due to those injury concerns and those medical red flags that NFL teams raised, as well as probably some NFL teams questioning his passion for the game, right? Because part of the thing that Phillips did during his 2 years not playing football was he tried to get into music. And so how NFL teams are like, are you a football first guy? And I feel like there's the potential, we'll see how it all plays out, that teams could do a similar thing with Latu, not only because of the injury concerns with that neck injury, and that neck injury, not to dismiss concussions, because we learned over the last decade how impactful concussions are for, the lifespan of football players, but not necessarily as impactful, although I'm sure the Dolphins would disagree with this with Tua. But typically concussions, you'll be able to play football again at some point later that season, and the neck injury is a little bit more iffier, right? So I wonder if that he'll get dinged a little bit more for the medical stuff. But also, I listened to an interview that he did with Bruce Feldman during the fall this past year, and Bruce Feldman asked him, if money was the same, would you rather play football or rugby? Because Latu was a big time rugby star in his youth. And Latu basically said, if the money was the same, I'd rather take rugby. And again, NFL teams are always looking for some reason to ding players, right? That's the whole point of the draft process, is basically nitpicking players to death. That's really what it's about. But so for that reason, I wonder if Latu could slide in a draft. And because of my expectations and my hope, and I'm sure many of your shared expectations and hopes that the Falcons will not be picking as high as they have the last couple of years, maybe picking in the latter part of the first round, could we see a talented player like Latu, who deserves to be picked higher, similar to Jalen Phillips, slide in the draft and be in the position where the Falcons can nab him, say pick 16, pick 20, pick 24, wherever the Falcons wind up picking 32, who knows? All right. But, I think the last point I'll say about Laiatu Latu is, you'll see a lot of mock drafts that project the Falcons to take edge rushers over the next several weeks or months. And a lot of those guys are going to be undersized guys, like, Alabama, Will Anderson's former teammate Dallas Turner is like 240, but he's listed at 240, but he might only be like 225. But if you ask me, but we know that Ryan Nielsen is a size king, right? He likes his edges big, and Latu's, I think, listed around 265. He may be bigger than that, but I know coming out of high school, because he was playing rugby, he was probably bigger than that. He was like 270, 280 potentially, when he was a freshman at Washington. So that's a guy that does have the size, I think, that will attract the Falcons rather than some of these other edge rushers that I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about over the coming months, that are, a little bit undersized in the sub 250 range. I don't know if the Falcons are going to be that interested in those guys moving forward. So that's the last little tidbit about Laiatu Latu. Tomorrow we'll be potentially talking about another prospect on the offensive side of the ball, a pass catcher, but is not a wide receiver. Interesting. But I think that's going to be a player that Arthur Smith is a big fan of. So that is potentially on deck for tomorrow's episode, looking ahead to the 2024 draft, as well as looking at this Tampa Bay Bucks team and their chances of winning the NFC South, despite their long odds, talking with James Yarko of the Locked On Bucks podcast. But that is in store for you guys that continue to make us your first listen on tomorrow's episode. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL podcast. And of course, there's a lot of things going on in Atlanta sports. The Braves are cooking. The Hawks are doing stuff. I don't know if they're doing all the stuff that people want them to do with NFL. I'm sorry, not NFL, NBA free agency kicking off. So there's a lot to explore there. And of course, the Bulldogs are going strong. Can they, is anybody going to knock them off their pedestal? Of course, all of that is available on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. So check it out. Of course, you can subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every